Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
All right. My name is Holly Bellebuono. I'm an herbalist, and Richard Paradise asked me to introduce this film. I have not seen it, but it involves a lot of topics that I'm familiar with, including ethnobotany. And when he told me about the film, I Googled it and looked on Wikipedia and IMDb, and it didn't mention two names that I was sure must be associated with this film, which are the ethnobotanists who the film is loosely based on. It's a fictional story, but it is loosely based on these very real people. And one of them is Richard Evans Schultes, and he was an ethnobotanist who did most of his work during World War II, so the 1940s, traveling to the Amazon, working with plants, with indigenous cultures, and eventually tracking and supporting rubber tree plantations to support the war. And he became one of the leading ethnobotanists in the country, in the world, really, and ended up teaching at Harvard for a long time. So one of the characters in this film is named Evans and is loosely based on Schultes, who was the real ethnobotanist. And he published a number of books. One of them is Ethnobotany, which I've got here if you want to look at it later. And one of his students was Wade Davis, who is well known as an indigenous cultures expert, has published his own books, and then his book was the basis for The Serpent and the Rainbow, which was produced by Wes Craven a while back, and is kind of the standard for ethnobotany and indigenous culture exploration of plants, and especially for hallucinogens. So their biographies are sort of the basis of this film, but more important than their biographies to me are some of the topics and the ideas behind what we will probably see. So I'm going to be looking for two things as I watch the film for the first time. And one of them is the incorporation or the idea of women as healers, women shamans in particular. And I don't know that we'll see that much of it, of women inclusion, philosophy of women healing in the film, but it is a very important thing in ethnobotany in general. And I did a documentary book on women healers because I wasn't seeing too much honoring or acknowledgement of women's work in botany, ethnobotany, sciences, and medicine in particular. And so I went around, I traveled quite a bit and did a project for 7 years where I interviewed women of indigenous cultures, regular first world cultures, herbalists, scientists, chemists, pharmacists, and a number of them were shamans. And so I wanted to introduce you to a few of them tonight because I think it's relevant as a juxtaposition for the male shamans that we're going to see in the film. So this is Auntie Velma Della Pena. She's a shaman that I interviewed in Hawaii, and she's a kapuna, which is an elder, and a kahuna, which is a healer. And she practices lomi lomi massage and ho'oponopono, which is a mediation technique for communities, as well as la'au lapa'au, which is Hawaiian herbal medicine. And Dr. Lillian Chang, she's a Taoist master from China. I interviewed her also in Hawaii, where she runs an acupuncture clinic and is seen in her culture partly as a Taoist master and partly as a shaman. Enriqueta Contreras, who is most definitely a shaman from Oaxaca, Mexico. She's a Zapotecan shaman. And she comes to the U.S. occasionally to teach, especially midwifery and the arts of saving lives through shamanistic techniques, as well as herbal and other methods. Mama Kia Ingenlath and her work in Peru. She ran an orphanage in Peru and was really dedicated to teaching children their indigenous culture and preserving their native dance and language and song and medicine and healing techniques, as well as saving the kids off the street and protecting them from poverty. Ada Belinda Dancing Lion, she is Native American, Lakota, and Anishinaabe. Raylene Kawaea, also from Hawaii, and she became a very dear friend of mine. So during this process of documenting all these women, she was a good springboard for asking questions about indigenous cultures and philosophy and how a lot of these indigenous practices are disappearing and hopefully being revived, especially in Hawaii. And I wanted to feature these women here because I'm going to be looking in this film tonight for the inclusion of women, even though I don't think it's going to be there too much, partly because Richard Evans Schultes and the people in this fictional film were in the 1940s, and there wasn't a whole lot of women inclusion in many professions, especially in the US back then. We weren't included in science and pharmacy or in medicine. And it kind of begs the question, who is a healer? Who is given the go-ahead to work in these fields, or who was, especially back then? It's a question that comes up in my herbal medicine school occasionally. What is healing and where does it come from? What's the provenance of healing? Who has the ability to heal or to cure? And even beyond that, who has the authority to heal? In our Western culture, we tend to say that doctors have the authority to heal. But in an indigenous culture, like most of these women, and in the film that we're about to see, most people would probably say, well, my family can heal me, or my friends can heal me, or my church group can heal me. It doesn't have to just be the doctor. So it's an authority that we choose to give certain people and restrict from other people. So that's one thing that I'm going to be looking for in the film. And the second thing is the symbolism of plants, especially for transformation. So in my work, because I'm a plant geek, I think about plants and their imagery and what it means to people, and I've found that there are two primary ways that we think about plants and transformation. And one is as a portal, and we usually see it as a tree. And we think of it in terms of the end of life. So death, the spirit or the soul leaves the body, travels through a tree, and we see this in everything from Scandinavia to Australia. These cultures believe that the tree is the portal or the gateway where the soul or the spirit can travel downward through the root to the underworld in order to travel on, or upward through the branches to the upper world. And either way, it's a transportation of the soul, but also a transformation from life to death. And it's very finite. There's no return. There's no idea that this person is ever going to come back. It's a gateway to something very incomprehensible. So it's death. And that's one image that we use plants for. It's very common. But then the other image that I think we're probably going to see in this film is the idea of plants as a gateway in life, where we use the plant to go on a journey of some sort, a rite of passage, into another realm of thinking, but then we come back. And it's not finite, it's not leaving, it's using these herbs or these plants in a more hallucinogenic way to achieve visions or answers that we might not normally get, and then bring those answers back to us in our current life. And that's really probably what we're going to see in this film, because that's the basis, or that's one of the favorite topics of ethnobotanists. So you can use narcotics from plants to achieve bliss and peace. Above that, you can use plants as hallucinogens to achieve visions and different level of thinking. But even beyond that is another level called entheogens. And plants that are entheogens are herbs or plants that have substances in them that help you achieve that other level, that state of being, but it's really more of a sacred journey. And so you're seeing God, which is really what entheogen means. It means theos, en theos, so God is within. So it's looking at more of the sanctity of life around you using plants as a tool. And it can be achieved in an individual setting, like people just doing it on their own, but more often than not, it's achieved in a community setting. And so another woman that I interviewed for my documentary book, this is Bernadette Rabineau. She was in Gabon, Africa, and she is a leader of these rites of passage for young women and young men in Gabon who, she's called an auntie, and she facilitates the use of a certain plant called iboga, which has an alkaloid in it called ibogaine, which is a hallucinogen, but they use it in these events, these rites, so that it's not just a hallucinogen, it reaches that level of entheogen, so that it's a sacred journey. And the people who undergo this journey are teenagers who are approaching maturity, and it's a rite of passage for them. And the people who facilitate it are called aunts and uncles to protect them so they don't overdose and so that they come back healthy, because the whole point is to come back with an awareness of something greater than yourself, with an awareness of wisdom or a sense of realization or even epiphany. And it's not necessarily to answer questions, but to inspire you to even ask more questions. And the result of these ceremonies is supposed to improve you as a person so that you're more self-actualized and self-realized, but also improve you as a community member so that when you come back from this journey, unlike the tree as a portal for death where you're gone, you're meant to return and share your knowledge with the greater community around you. So looking at the two different images, the world tree is a portal, but it's at the end. The entheogens are the herbs that are meant to bring these visions, and that's what these ethnobotanists, Richard Evans Schultes and other people like Wade Davis, were finding in the Amazon, and that's, I think, what we're likely going to see in this film. I would encourage you to look for these broader truths, these images and these symbols in the film as well, as I will be doing. So women will see how that has progressed over time. And then the entheogens, the plants, and how they use it for spiritual purposes. And we're going to have a time for Q&A afterwards. So that will be right afterwards, and I look forward to having a discussion with you. Thanks.
Holly, what are your thoughts on this film now that you have actually seen it? You had two things going in there. So what did you see? What did you hear that that resonated with you?
One thing, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the tale of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh. I saw a lot of imagery of that in there, where Gilgamesh is a king who is told about a magic plant, a plant of immortality that's meant to cure everything, and he goes on a quest. So it's a search, just like this ethnobotanist was searching for this magical plant, and he ends up finding it, but then it's taken away from him by, of all things, a serpent, which represents rejuvenation and new life. So he does discover new life, but he doesn't get to enjoy it himself. So I saw some of that imagery in this. Are there any?
Yeah, good.
So I'm no expert on Schultes and ethnobotany in general, but the ideas behind it and the ideas of the regenerative properties of plants and the imagery of, not particularly the jaguar, but the snake and some of the other symbolism of transformation and transcendence in particular, I thought were very striking, especially compared to the earlier movie, the Wes Craven movie, The Serpent and the Rainbow, which addressed a lot of this too, but it was a lot more gruesome. And this one touched a lot more on religion and dogma, I thought, which was pretty frightening.
Do we have questions from our audience for Holly for her to answer? I see some. Any hands? No. So, what can you tell us about the plant life in the Amazon that you know? Because this is, I guess the Amazon is the most richly dense and most diverse part of our planet.
I do know that Richard Evans Schultz, when he went through in the 40s, was said to have collected or studied almost 20,000 plants and brought back with him 300 of which are named or are new to science, and many of them are named after him. So his collections that went on to Harvard, to the herbarium up there, are very real, and he did actually haul all of them back out of the jungle.
Interesting. What can you tell us about what you knew about him going into this movie? Because and your knowledge of him, has it changed since seeing what you've
Well,
gotten?
he is known as the father of ethnobotany and especially hallucinogenics in particular, and he influenced a lot of literature and poetry because of this transcendent idea of hallucinogenic substances. But then he went on to teach at Harvard, mostly about indigenous cultures, and was known as kind of a gentleman professor with a very calm and easygoing demeanor, and influenced people to look at hallucinogens not in a primitive or pagan sort of way like is depicted in the films, but in more of a philosophical way, looking at the human condition.
Questions yet? Yeah. Hold on. We want to make sure that because on the camera cannot pick up this unless you're actually talking into a mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Holly. I noticed one of your comments earlier was about the relevance or the prevalence of female healers in indigenous cultures, and we didn't see any of that. And also, what I did notice is from what I've heard is that some of these plants that are teacher plants and healer plants are actually considered feminine. And I noticed we didn't hear that either, that it was, the Kapi in particular was considered a male spirit, and that it wasn't until the very end that we heard, go to her, she will teach you. That was, I was surprised that we get all the way to the end of the movie, and there it was.
Yeah, it was a very masculine-based movie and a very masculine era. The whole time period, the whole profession, everything has been very masculine until more recently, from the 1970s onward, when people are starting to think about the Great Mother and the feminine portrayal of beauty and cycles and patterns and rhythms that kind of embody the woman's side of human nature. And we're starting to look back on old myths and see those in the past where they were always there but never quite appreciated. And they're coming back now as, I wouldn't say vogue, but being more understood and more appreciated as relevant in mythology and folklore and even fairy tale and definitely science and art. We're seeing the feminine more. So like my work earlier, the Women Healers of the World documentary book, I put together because there wasn't that women's presence. It wasn't in films like this, it wasn't anywhere. And so to recognize the women that are contributing to medicine and healing and midwifery and pharmacy, I think is really important because, like this shows, it hasn't been appreciated as much as it should be.
Other questions? Yes. Let me come down your way here. Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. How fast is the Amazon disappearing in terms of being destroyed? This took place in the 40s. I'm sure so much of it has disappeared since then. And
Yeah, I really don't know numbers about that. I
but it
couldn't
is
address that.
being
But
destroyed, though, right?
it really is.
Cut and burn and
The rainforest in general for plantations of all sorts, especially palm for palm oil. But there's a organization called United Plant Savers that is a nonprofit that is working to address especially medicinal herbal conservation in North America and South America. So partly the rainforest, but just in general, all sorts of plants, and bringing that to the attention of people so that can be rectified.
I've got a just general question to prove how stupid I am. How are plants tested on people? At what point does they say, hey, eat this? Somebody's got to be the first one. And they say, oh, well, he died, so I guess that was probably a bad idea. How does a shaman go about understanding the value of these plants, from the very first time they see something to the time that they recommend it? There's got to be a trial period.
I'm sure. So shamanism, the word, was attributed to groups of medicine men and women in Russia and Siberia first. And it's been incorporated in the educational system where we call everyone who does what he did shaman. So the word is applied across the board, whether it fits or not. And their knowledge generally comes from a spiritual tradition. But I saw a lot of religion in this film, which is a little bit different from spiritual tradition and discovery and, I think looking to find the plants and figuring out how they work has been very much an intuitive process. And you could see that dichotomy there between the intuition and the science. They were butting heads the whole time. So it's an interesting process that's been going on for thousands of years, I think.
Yeah.
My take on it, and I've been in the Peruvian Amazon twice this year, is that is the question. We didn't discover ayahuasca or the plant medicines. It was a gift, and she is a feminine energy, and it would be impossible to come up with the mixture because actually the ayahuasca is taken, the chacruna, the yocruna, and the kapi together. They're not drank individually as we saw on the movie.
Thank you. Other questions? Comments?
I think it's just interesting to think about where people are coming from with that question in particular, intuition versus science, and how they can support each other actually and blend so that we learn from all the traditions and don't exclude and don't say one is better than the other. That's where a lot of the politics and the war and the strife and the conflict came from, I think, is saying that this way works but that doesn't. And that if we can appreciate the perceptive, intuitive research that's being done by indigenous cultures, as well as the science that's being done by pharmacology and other researchers in what we call the first world, I think everyone has a lot to offer, and we can all learn from each other. So that's one takeaway from this film.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your time here with us, and we appreciate your audience for coming in and spending a couple of hours with us. Hope you enjoyed the film.